Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive in. Today, it's the Challenger disaster. We're using the American Scandal podcast, the one from Wondery, as our guide. It's one of those events, I think, where everybody, like, remembers exactly where they were when it happened, but do we really understand how it all unfolded, all the decisions leading up to it?
Yeah, that's the point of this deep dive, right? It's not just about the tragic accident itself. It's about all the pieces that led to that day, the choices, the pressures, the human side of things.
It seems like the story really starts in November 1982. There's this NASA project manager, Larry Malloy, and he's at Thiokol. They're the ones who made those solid rocket boosters for the shuttle. He's going over some reports and finds one talking about burn damage on an O-ring from a previous launch.
And here's where it gets interesting. Those O-rings, they're basically rubber seals, right? They're there to stop fuel leaks in the joints of those boosters. Might seem simple, but they're absolutely crucial. But here's the thing. NASA was really pushing to launch shuttles more often, and even a tiny chance of those O-rings failing was a huge risk.
But Thiokol, they kind of brushed it off, right?
They did. They said only one O-ring out of hundreds had that kind of damage, called it, like a one-off thing. They assured Malloy that even if one failed, there was a backup.
Okay, a backup. But what if both of them failed?
Well, Thiokol did say, hypothetically, if both O-rings failed, it could cause an explosion. But they said the odds of that were, incredibly small, 1 in 10,000.
1 in 10,000. That's not exactly a comforting number. It's not zero.
No, it's not. And remember, NASA's acceptable risk for a catastrophic failure when there's a crew on board was 1 in a million. So, yeah, huge difference. It really shows that constant battle between how much risk you're willing to take and the pressure to just keep going. And Malloy, knowing how important those launch schedules were to NASA, he seemed to accept what Thiokol was saying.
So let's move on to 1984. The public, they weren't as excited about the space program anymore, and NASA needed to get them back on board, get that funding secured. That's where the Teacher in Space program comes in.
Oh, yeah, brilliant PR move. They picked Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher, tons of charisma, loved education. It was perfect to bring the program back into the spotlight.
But, and it's a big but, that decision also meant even more pressure to keep those launches on schedule, flawless record. And all this while, they had those O-ring concerns already in the background.
It's ironic, right? Remember Johnny Carson on The Tonight Show? He made a joke to McAuliffe about how those shuttle parts were probably made by the lowest bidder. Seemed funny then, but knowing what we know now, it's kind of creepy, like it was hinting at the problems of cutting corners.
Definitely. So we're seeing these pressures building inside and outside NASA. Let's fast forward a bit. 1984 to 1985. This is where things start getting really worrying. We've got a Thiokol engineer, Roger Boisjoli, and he's finding some seriously concerning stuff.
Boisjoli, he'd been studying those recovered boosters from the Discovery mission, and he found more damage, more of those O-ring problems. Some were pretty bad, like one was almost a complete burn-through. That means those flames almost broke right through the booster casing while it was in flight. Imagine if that happened during takeoff.
That's terrifying. Did anyone even listen to him? Did they take it seriously?
Boisjoli was particularly worried about the cold, how those low temperatures would affect the O-rings. He showed them data, but Thiokol and NASA, they just dismissed him.
Why? What possible reason could they have for ignoring him?
Well, they said the data wasn't clear enough and that maybe he was just being too cautious. They were focused on the big picture, the mission, and they probably just downplayed the risk.
So they ignore their own engineers. The warnings, hard to believe. And then there's Bob Ebeling, another engineer at Thiokol. He seemed to really get how serious this all was.
Oh, Abeling, he was getting more and more worried about the safety issues. Tried to stop production altogether, said people could die. He was, literally yelling in the hallways, telling everyone there'd be blood on their hands if they launched.
To be ignored like that, knowing what we know now, it must have been awful. His story just shows you the human cost of these decisions.
Definitely. Reminds us that behind all the technical stuff, there were real people wrestling with their conscience, trying to do the right thing.
And then as we get into late 1985, early 1986, the pressure on NASA was just enormous. Delays were piling up, and they started taking shortcuts with maintenance. They had this super ambitious launch schedule.
Which, of course, creates this environment where safety concerns, they just get pushed aside. Meeting deadlines, hitting those goals, that's all that matters. It's a really dangerous way to operate.
So we've got ignored warnings, a crazy launch schedule, and all these technical problems being minimized. What happens next?
Things get, Get even more tense in January 1986. A big cold front hits Florida. I mean, really unusual cold. They're predicting it'll be the coldest shuttle launch ever.
And those engineers at Thiokol, the ones worried about the O-rings, they must have been feeling the heat, knowing how bad that cold could be for those seals.
Oh, absolutely. On the evening of January 27th, they have this teleconference. NASA officials, Thiokol engineers, including Alan McDonald and Roger Boisjoly, the ones we've been talking about. You can just imagine how tense that call must have been.
What was it like? How did that conversation go? Where did they disagree?
The Thiokol engineers, they had their data and they came right out and said, don't launch in this cold. They explained how it would make the O-ring rubber stiff. It wouldn't seal properly against those hot gases when the boosters ignited. Way too risky, they said.
But NASA, they had all those delays, the pressure to get things going. Did they just push back against what Thiokol was saying?
They did. Some of the NASA managers, they questioned the data, said it wasn't conclusive, that maybe the engineers were being too cautious. You can feel that pressure from NASA to just launch, even with all the concerns.
Wow, to be a fly on the wall for that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So did Thiokol stick to their guns? Did they say no launch?
They didn't. I mean, they had their engineers saying it was dangerous, but Thiokol management, they caved. They had a quick offline discussion just among themselves, and then they reversed their position, told NASA it was okay to launch.
It's got to be heartbreaking to be one of those engineers, knowing the risks, presenting the evidence, and then your own company overrules you.
It really shows how those outside pressures can just override even the most important safety rules, and it shows how much responsibility those engineers were carrying.
So the decision is made. Challenger is going to launch the next morning, January 28th, 1986. Beautiful day, clear skies, but freezing cold at Cape Canaveral.
Temperatures just barely above freezing. Right there on the launch pad, you could see ice on the shuttle, millions of people watching on TV, kids waiting for Krista McAuliffe's Lessons from Space, everyone excited.
It's almost hard to watch, knowing what's going to happen and seeing all that excitement.
It's such a contrast, right? That's what makes this so powerful, I think. The countdown keeps going, and at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Time, Challenger lifts off.
And then
73 seconds later, disaster. Massive fireball. The shuttle breaks apart in the sky. Debris falls into the ocean. All 7 crew members gone.
it must have been just shock for everyone watching.
The whole country was traumatized. The idea that space travel could be routine, it was shattered. Right away, there's grief, confusion. Everyone wants answers. President Reagan forms a commission led by William Rogers, former Secretary of State, to investigate what happened.
And what did they find? What caused the explosion?
The Rogers Commission, they did a deep dive, and their findings were pretty damning. They said those O-rings, the cold made them brittle. They didn't seal right when the booster rockets ignited. Hot gases escaped, caused a structural failure in the booster, and that destroyed the shuttle.
So it was exactly what those engineers had warned about. It was tragic.
Yeah, exactly. The commission's report, it was really critical of both NASA and Thiokol. They said their decision-making was flawed, that they cared more about deadlines than safety, and that they didn't listen to their own engineers. Launching was a mistake right from the start.
Awful. 7 lives lost because those warnings were ignored. Such a loss.
The impact of Challenger, it was huge, and it's still felt today, not just in the space program, but anywhere that risk management and communication are important.
Makes you think, makes you ask hard questions. How do we balance ambition and progress with keeping people safe? How do we build a culture where people can speak up, where different opinions matter?
And how do we learn from what happened to stop something like Challenger from ever happening again?
So we know the technical cause, the O-rings failing. But there's this deeper story here, isn't there? About communication breakdowns, the pressure to succeed, a whole system that wasn't working.
You're right. It's a reminder that even in space exploration, with all the technology, it's human decisions, human mistakes that can lead to both our greatest achievements and our worst tragedies.
Let's talk about what happened after the disaster. What were the long-term effects for NASA and for how you think about risk? It's tough, to really grasp what something like Challenger means, the full impact. We lost those 7 astronauts, but it's so much bigger than that. It feels like a failure on so many levels. Communication breaking down, leadership, the whole culture that let them launch that shuttle.
Yeah, no, you're right. The Rogers Commission, they didn't stop at just the technical stuff. They went right at the heart of NASA's culture. They said there was this tendency to not really listen to concerns, not give them enough weight. Think about those engineers, the ones trying to raise a red flag about the O-rings. Their voices just got lost in a system that seemed more worried about looking good than facing the risks.
And that report, it didn't pull any punches when it came to criticizing how NASA made decisions, did it?
Nope, not at all. They said it straight up. The pressure to stay on schedule and not wanting to admit how bad the O-ring problem was, it created a recipe for disaster.
It's like they were blind to the danger staring them in the face.
There's this idea about normalization of deviance that really applies here. It's like when small problems, things not quite right, keep happening, but nothing major goes wrong. Well, we start to think that's normal, that it's okay.
So you get used to the risk, you don't see it as clearly anymore.
Exactly. Like with Challenger, they'd seen O-ring erosion on flights before. Because it hadn't caused a major accident yet, they kind of downplayed how dangerous it was.
It's scary to think that complacency could lead to something so terrible.
Challenger, it's a stark reminder that safety can't be an afterthought, ever. It shows how important it is to have open communication where everyone can speak up, where different ideas are valued, and risks are looked at carefully, honestly.
Thinking about those engineers, knowing they could hurt their careers by speaking up, it's really something.
People like Roger Boisjoli, Bob Ebeling, they became whistleblowers, and they paid a price for it. Their stories show how we need ethical leaders, people who will protect those who speak truth to power, especially when it comes to safety.
Challenger, it was a national tragedy, no doubt. But it also changed things, didn't it? Forced NASA to change. And it had effects far beyond the space program.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone had to step back and look at what really mattered. Safety became the top priority, and there was this new understanding that no goal, no matter how ambitious, is worth a human life.
And that's a lesson that goes way beyond just space exploration, right? Any organization, any industry that deals with risk, they can learn from this.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this. We've seen how dangerous groupthink can be, how important it is to have people who are willing to disagree, and how crucial it is to really assess the risks. The question is, how can we take these lessons and use them in our own lives, our own work? How can we make sure that tragedies like Challenger aren't just something we remember, but something we actually learn from?
Powerful words to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Challenger disaster. We'll see you next time as we continue to explore the stories behind the headlines.